In the mist-shrouded valleys of western Kentucky, where ancient trees guard secrets older than the settlements they surround, lies the documented account of an incident that has defied explanation for over a century and a half. In 1857, 5 cousins from the Sullivan family arrived at the isolated community of Ravenwood Hollow, a place so remote that mapmakers of the era marked it simply as uninhabited wilderness. What transpired during their 7-day visit was meticulously recorded in the personal diary of Dr. James Thornton, a document discovered in 1923 when the abandoned town's records were uncovered during a railway expansion. The journal entries describe events so precise, so unnervingly accurate that modern psychological researchers have studied them extensively, yet none can explain how 5 children, ranging from ages 8 to 13, could possess knowledge that challenged the very laws of nature itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sullivan cousins didn't merely predict forthcoming events. With startling precision, they revealed buried family histories spanning generations, described people they had never encountered, and spoke of tragedies that occurred decades before any of them were born. But perhaps most disturbing of all, every single revelation they shared proved to be verifiably, undeniably true when investigated. This channel explores mysteries that most refuse to acknowledge. If you're seeking comfortable explanations that fit neatly into conventional understanding, perhaps look elsewhere. But for those brave enough to confront enigmas that challenge our perception of reality itself, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to uncover details about the Sullivan cousins that most historians deliberately avoid discussing. Tell us in the comments what state you're watching from, because what happened in Kentucky might have occurred closer to your home than you realize. The story begins not with supernatural phenomena, but with something far more unsettling. The possibility that certain human minds, particularly young ones, can access information through channels science still cannot comprehend. The Kentucky of 1857 was a land divided between the rapidly industrializing North and the plantation-dominated South, where isolated communities like Ravenwood Hollow existed in virtual seclusion among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1831 by 4 families, seeking refuge from the cholera epidemics ravaging larger towns. By the time the Sullivan family arrived, Ravenwood Hollow consisted of barely 150 souls, most connected through marriage or distant relation, all governed by the strict Methodist principles that structured their daily existence. The community centered around a modest stone chapel built by their own hands, using limestone from the surrounding hills. Dr. James Thornton, a scholarly man who had abandoned a promising career in Louisville to serve these isolated people, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and noteworthy events. His methodical nature would prove crucial in documenting the inexplicable events about to unfold. Thomas Sullivan was already known throughout the scattered communities of the region. Tall and imposing, with a shock of prematurely white hair that contrasted sharply with his youthful face of 39 years, he traveled by wagon with his 5 young charges, carrying only essential provisions and the leather-bound journal where he documented their unusual experiences. He had become guardian to the children 3 years earlier, following a tragic steamboat explosion on the Ohio River that claimed the lives of his brother and sister-in-law, along with the parents of his other 3 nieces and nephews. The 5 Sullivan cousins presented a study in contrasts despite their shared bloodline. Elizabeth, the eldest at 13, possessed a serious demeanor that made her seem far older than her years. Her analytical mind and unflinching gaze often made adults uncomfortable in her presence. James and William, 11-year-old twins, were physically identical but opposite in temperament, James being contemplative and quiet, while William exhibited boundless energy and curiosity. Mary, 9, was slight and delicate, with an ethereal quality that many mistook for fragility until they witnessed her remarkable intuition. Samuel, the youngest at 8, rarely spoke above a whisper, but when he did, his words carried weight beyond his years. What distinguished the Sullivan family among travelers was their peculiar reputation. Stories followed them from town to town. Tales of lost items suddenly located, of ancient family quarrels suddenly resolved, of hidden crimes unexpectedly confessed in their presence. Some attributed this to Thomas Sullivan's commanding presence and piercing gaze, but those who observed more carefully noted that the real changes began after the children had spent time among the local families. The journey to Ravenwood Hollow had been extraordinarily difficult. Relentless spring floods had washed away bridges and turned roads into impassable mud, forcing the family to abandon their wagon 10 miles from their destination. Thomas had carried young Samuel for the final stretch when the boy developed chills from a river crossing gone wrong. They arrived as dusk settled on May 12, 1857, just as Dr. Thornton was concluding his evening rounds among patients suffering from a persistent fever that had plagued the community for weeks. Thornton later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of remarkable composure, despite their obvious exhaustion. Thomas Sullivan's clothes showed signs of hard travel, but were meticulously maintained, his back straight despite the obvious strain of their journey. The children gathered around him with an unusual discipline, their eyes scanning the settlement with an alertness that seemed inappropriate for their young ages. Even Samuel, pale from his recent illness, watched the inhabitants of Ravenwood Hollow with unnerving intensity. The people of Ravenwood Hollow had extended hospitality to many travelers over the years, but there was something distinctly different about the Sullivan family from the very beginning. That first evening, as the family shared a meal with Dr. Thornton and his wife Margaret, Elizabeth commented on the doctor's unique medical bag, specifically inquiring about the silver instruments inside that had been passed down through 4 generations of his family. Margaret Thornton had dropped her fork, staring at the child in astonishment. The medical kit's history was indeed a source of private pride for the doctor, but it was not something they discussed with strangers, especially given the unusual circumstances through which it had come into his possession. His great-grandfather, having acquired it during the Revolutionary War from a British field surgeon under controversial circumstances that the family rarely mentioned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When pressed, Elizabeth simply smiled and said, "Some objects carry their histories with them, Mrs. Thornton. Your husband's tools have saved many lives to balance the ones they couldn't save on the battlefield." This incident, recorded in Dr. Thornton's journal that very night, would prove to be merely the first of many that would challenge everything the Ravenwood Hollow community understood about the natural world. The following morning dawned bright and clear, with birdsong filling the air around the modest cabin where the Sullivan family had been housed. Dr. Thornton rose early to check on patients suffering from the persistent fever, only to find Thomas Sullivan already awake and sitting on the porch, his journal open, but his eyes fixed on the chapel at the center of the settlement. "The children had troubling dreams last night," Thomas explained when Thornton inquired about his pensive expression. "They often dream of the places we visit, but these dreams contained unusual details, darker implications than uncomfortable with." Before Thornton could respond, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her dark hair nearly braided, her expression unnaturally composed for a child her age. "Dr. Thornton," she said in her clear, decisive voice, "in your chapel, beneath the altar cloth, there's a hidden compartment containing something that doesn't belong in a house of worship. Mary dreamed about it, and Samuel understood why it's hidden." The doctor felt a chill despite the morning sunshine. He had indeed constructed a small hidden compartment beneath the altar 3 years prior, where he kept a pistol for protection following a series of troubling incidents with travelers. passing through the region. Not a soul knew about it. He had built it himself during a night when the entire community was gathered at a neighboring settlement for a wedding celebration. What exactly did Mary dream? Thornton asked, struggling to maintain his composure. Mary stepped forward, moving with a peculiar grace that seemed almost choreographed. "The pistol is English-made with pearl inlays on the handle," she said quietly. "You took it from Mr. Henderson after he threatened Mrs. Collins last autumn. You didn't tell anyone because Mr. Henderson is Mrs. Thornton's cousin, and you wanted to protect her from the scandal." Thornton gripped the porch railing as the blood drained from his face. Every detail was precisely accurate. Jonathan Henderson had indeed threatened Martha Collins during a dispute over property boundaries, brandishing the distinctive pistol Mary had described. As the community's physician and unofficial mediator, Thornton had intervened, confiscating the weapon and later hiding it in the chapel for safekeeping. The fact that Henderson was related to his wife through marriage was knowledge shared by few in the community. Thomas watched the doctor's reaction with an expression mixing sympathy and resignation. "It began when they were very young," he explained. "Quietly, after the steamboat tragedy, something changed in them. At first, I thought it was simply the trauma of loss making them more observant, more sensitive to the world around them. But as time passed, their insights became increasingly specific, increasingly impossible to explain through natural means. That Sunday service would be remembered by every member of the Ravenwood Hollow congregation for decades to come. Thomas Sullivan had been invited to offer a few words as a visiting elder, and his message was heartfelt but unremarkable, a simple reflection on community and perseverance through hardship. It was what happened afterward that defied rational explanation. As the congregation prepared to depart, Elizabeth approached Judge Wilson, a stern man whose reputation for fairness in legal matters extended throughout the county. She looked up at him with clear eyes and said, "Judge Wilson, the evidence you destroyed in the Abernathy case wasn't really protecting the community, was it? You just couldn't bear to see your daughter implicated." The judge froze mid-step, his face draining of color. For 3 years, he had carried the secret of his interference in a local investigation, having removed and burned a blood-stained shawl belonging to his daughter that had been found near the site where Colin Abernathy had been discovered beaten nearly to death. He had told himself his actions served the greater good, preventing a scandal that would have torn the community apart, but the weight of his compromise had haunted him ever since. Before Wilson could recover, young James approached Martha Collins, the elderly widow who served as the settlement's unofficial historian and moral compass. "Mrs. Collins, the documents you've been hiding about the original land purchases tell a different story than the one you've shared, don't they? The founders didn't buy this land. They took it from people who already lived here." The elderly woman clutched her prayer book so tightly her knuckles whitened. The land grants and purchase records she maintained had indeed been carefully edited over the years to obscure the fact that the original settlers had displaced a small group of mixed heritage families who had lived in the area for generations. The official history she had helped craft spoke only of uninhabited wilderness, erasing the previous inhabitants from Ravenwood Hollow's story entirely. William moved confidently through the stunned congregation, stopping before Robert Mitchell, the community's most successful merchant. "Mr. Mitchell, the extra ledger you keep beneath your bedroom floorboards shows different numbers than the ones you share with your business partners. Is it still stealing if you're only taking from people who have plenty?" Mitchell's successful trading business had made him wealthy by local standards, but few knew that his prosperity came partially from systematically skimming small amounts from every transaction with his Louisville partners. He had justified his actions by telling himself they would never miss such small percentages from their substantial profits, but he had never spoken of this arrangement to anyone. Samuel, despite his young age and usual reticence, approached Dr. Fisher, who had traveled from a neighboring settlement to attend the service. Dr. Fisher, he whispered, barely audible but somehow carrying through the silent church. The medicine you've been giving to the Anderson family isn't what you claim it is. Real medicine costs more than they can pay, so you give them colored water and sugar instead. 3 of them will die before winter. The visiting physician staggered backward as if physically struck. His fraudulent practice of substituting useless mixtures for actual medicine when treating poorer families was his most closely guarded secret, one he had maintained for years while building a reputation as a compassionate healer. Mary, her delicate features composed despite the growing tension in the chapel, walked to Sarah Jenkins, a young woman recently returned from schooling in Philadelphia. "The baby you lost before coming home," she said gently, "wasn't your shame to carry alone. Professor Whitaker should have protected you instead of sending you away." Sarah collapsed into tears, her carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. Not even her parents knew the real reason for her sudden return, that her trusted teacher had taken advantage of her, then arranged for her to be sent home when the consequences became apparent. She had carried the grief of her lost child and betrayed trust entirely alone, telling everyone that she simply missed her family too desperately to remain away. One by one, the Sullivan cousins moved through the congregation, speaking quietly to different members, revealing secrets that should have been known only to those who carried them. Each revelation was delivered without malice or judgment, presented with the matter-of-fact innocence of children simply sharing observations. Yet the precision of their statements was so exact, so impossible, that the congregation stood paralyzed. In collective shock, Dr. Thornton watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was laid bare by 5 children, who spoke of matters that should have been known only to God. But it was Elizabeth's final statement that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. She walked deliberately to the front of the chapel, placed her hand on the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar, and addressed the entire congregation. "This land has witnessed terrible things," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "The Crawford family wasn't lost to fever in 1832 as everyone claims. They died right here, in this very chapel, and some of you helped ensure they would never leave." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds outside seemed to have ceased their songs. Elizabeth's statement hung in the air like smoke, suffocating in its implications. The Crawford tragedy had been Ravenwood Hollow's most carefully guarded secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 25 years of collective silence. In 1832, when Ravenwood Hollow was still establishing itself, the Crawford family had been among its most respected members. Harold Crawford served as both carpenter and treasurer, while his wife Catherine was renowned for her knowledge of medicinal plants and midwifery. Their 3 children, Joshua, Caleb, and Ruth, had been bright, engaging youngsters who helped organize the community's first school. The official account, dutifully recorded in the earliest town records, stated that the entire Crawford family had succumbed to a particularly virulent fever during a harsh winter. Their remains had been interred in the cemetery with appropriate ceremony, and the community had mourned before moving forward as frontier settlements must when tragedy strikes. But Elizabeth's declaration suggested a vastly different reality, one that several older members of the congregation had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Davidson, now in his 70s and one of the original settlers, slowly rose from his seat. His joints protested the movement, but his voice remained strong when he finally spoke. "Child," he said, measuring each word carefully, "you speak of events that occurred long before your birth, in a place you've never visited until yesterday. How could you possibly know anything about the Crawfords?" Elizabeth turned to face him directly, her gaze unwavering. "Ruth Crawford had 6 fingers on her left hand," she said quietly. "Joshua collected unusual rocks that he kept in a leather pouch. Caleb had a dog named Pilot that refused to eat for weeks after the family died. When they were killed, Ruth was wearing a yellow dress that her mother had made from fabric brought all the way from Boston." These intimate details, Impossible for strangers to know. Sent a visible ripple of recognition through the older members of the congregation. Mrs. Davidson clutched her husband's arm, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "The night they died," Samuel continued, his whisper somehow audible throughout the chapel, "it wasn't fever that killed them. They came here seeking protection because they discovered something about the original land grants that certain founding families didn't want revealed." The chapel had grown so silent that the sound of breathing seemed intrusive. Dr. Thornton found himself recalling fragments of conversations he had overheard since arriving in Ravenwood Hollow, whispered exchanges that ceased when he approached, meaningful glances between the older residents when certain topics arose, the way some families always left wildflowers at an unmarked corner of the cemetery. Judge Wilson stood abruptly, his judicial authority temporarily overcoming his earlier shock. "This is preposterous," he declared, though uncertainty undermined his attempt at authority. "These children are weaving tales to frighten us. There's no conceivable way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details began emerging from the congregation itself. Mrs. Fisher mentioned bloodstains that had mysteriously appeared on the chapel floor years after the alleged fever. Deaths, stains that resisted all attempts to remove them. Old Thomas Jenkins recalled strange sounds that sometimes echoed through the chapel on winter nights, sounds like children crying that had been dismissed as wind through the chimney. Dr. Fisher, despite his earlier humiliation regarding his fraudulent medicines, found himself speaking with clinical detachment. "I've always wondered about the absence of graves," he said slowly. "The cemetery plot marked for the Crawfords contains no actual headstones, only the stone markers added years later. When I asked about it upon moving to the region, I was told the original markers had been damaged in a storm." The implication hung heavy in the air. If the Crawford family had indeed died in the chapel rather than from fever, if their bodies had been disposed of somewhere other than the marked cemetery plots, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had taken place in a space defiled by murder and deception. Thomas Sullivan had remained silent throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watched as his ward's impossible knowledge unraveled carefully maintained lies and exposed long-buried truths to the harsh light of day. "Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Thornton said, his voice strained with emotion, "how do your cousins know these things? What manner of ability allows them such insight?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before answering. "I've asked myself that question every day for 3 years," he finally replied. "Their parents believe that great trauma can sometimes open doorways in young minds, doorways that perhaps should remain closed. When the steamboat explosion took their parents, something changed in each of them. They began to know things they shouldn't know, see things they shouldn't see." He paused, looking at his young charges with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. "At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help bring peace to troubled souls. But over time, I've come to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess comes with a terrible price. They carry the burden of everyone's secrets, everyone's shame. They know things children should never have to know." As if summoned by their guardian's words, the 5 cousins gathered together at the front of the chapel. For the first time since their arrival, they truly looked like the children they were, vulnerable, overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't choose what we know," Elizabeth said, her earlier confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too profound for her 13 years. "The knowledge comes whether we welcome it or not. We see what has happened, what is happening beneath the surface, and sometimes what will come to pass." James nodded, unconsciously moving closer to his twin. "The Crawford children visit our dreams sometimes," he said quietly. "They want to be properly remembered. They want the truth to be known. The chapel fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people confronting concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and a few displayed a dawning hope that perhaps there was more to existence than their limited worldview had permitted them to believe. Dr. Thornton found himself at a crossroads that would define his future in Ravenwood Hollow. He could dismiss the Sullivan children's claims as elaborate deception or childish fantasy, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability. Or he could pursue the truth, wherever it might lead, risking the destruction of the foundations upon which the settlement had been built for nearly 3 decades. The decision would prove to have consequences that none present could have anticipated. That evening, as darkness settled over Ravenwood Hollow's scattered cabins, Dr. Thornton found himself unable to focus on his usual medical journals. Sullivan Cousins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their uncanny accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been subconsciously avoiding since his arrival 5 years earlier. He had come to Ravenwood Hollow eager to serve as both physician and spiritual guide to people seeking a simpler life away from the growing tensions that divided the nation. His predecessor, Dr. Alexander Grant, had left behind detailed records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Thornton had always noticed peculiar gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1832, in particular, contained conspicuous omissions, with the Crawford family's deaths recorded with unusual brevity compared to Grant's typically exhaustive notes. Determined to understand what the Sullivan children might have uncovered, Thornton began searching through the community's stored records with renewed purpose. Hidden beneath stacks of mundane documents in the chapel's small record room, he discovered a thin leather-bound volume he had never seen before. The pages were brittle with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably Dr. Grant's distinctive script. What Thornton read by lamplight that night transformed his understanding of Ravenwood Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Dr. Grant had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Crawford family's demise. According to his private notes, Harold Crawford had discovered discrepancies in the original land grants that established the settlement's legal claim to the territory. The journal entry dated January 17, 1832, was particularly revealing. H.C. approached me today with documents suggesting our founders never purchased this land legally. The original deeds appear to have been falsified, with signatures forged and boundaries altered. He intends to present his findings to the county authorities, believing our community must make proper restitution to the mixed heritage families who were displaced. I fear his moral certainty will be his undoing. The final relevant entry, dated February 3, 1832, chilled Thornton to his core. May God forgive what transpired last night. The Crawfords sought sanctuary in the chapel when threatened, but they found judgment instead. Elder Davidson and the founding families insisted their deaths were necessary to protect our future. I tended their wounds until it became clear they would not survive, then administered final mercy to spare their suffering. We agreed to tell the community it was fever. The children's bodies were the hardest to prepare. I shall carry this burden to my grave. Thornton set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Crawford family hadn't died from any illness. They had been deliberately killed to protect the founding family's fraudulent land claims. But how could the Sullivan children possibly know details of events that had occurred 25 years earlier? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal possessions, their unique physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Mary Sullivan standing. In the moonlight, her slight frame making her appear even younger than her 9 years. "Dr. Thornton," she said in her gentle voice, "you found Dr. Grant's secret journal, didn't you? The one he kept hidden behind the loose stone in the record room wall." Thornton stared at her in astonishment. He had indeed discovered the journal, exactly where she described, behind a stone that had shifted slightly from its mortar, creating a perfect hiding place. "How did you know where to find it?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Ruth Crawford showed me," Mary replied, matter-of-factly. "She said Dr. Grant was a good man trapped in terrible circumstances. She doesn't blame him for what happened at the end." The casual way she spoke of receiving guidance from a long-dead child sent chills down Thornton's spine. "Mary," he said, carefully, "what exactly do you see when you have these insights?" The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Thornton could see the burden she carried. "We see everything," she said simply. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Crawford family didn't begin as evil people. They started with small compromises that led to bigger ones, until they could justify even murder to protect what they had built on lies." "What were these compromises?" Thornton asked, dreading the answer but needing to hear it. Mary looked past him to where her cousin sat quietly in the cabin's main room. "The land for Ravenwood Hollow wasn't empty when the founders arrived," she said. "A small settlement of families, some white, some native, some former slaves, had lived here peacefully for years. The founders offered to buy the land, but when refused, they forged documents showing they had purchased it legally. When questions arose, they claimed the mixed heritage families had no legal right to the land at all." The pieces began falling into place in Thornton's mind. The earliest town records mentioned clearing the territory for settlement, but gave no details about previous inhabitants. Maps from that era marked the area simply as wilderness, despite evidence of long-term habitation that Thornton himself had observed. Old foundations that didn't match current buildings, fruit trees too neatly arranged to be wild artifacts, occasionally unearthed, that suggested a different cultural influence than the current settlers. "The chapel was built with stolen legacy," Mary continued, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that should have been impossible. "That's why the Crawford children can't rest. They died trying to restore what was taken from others." Thornton found himself confronting a truth more terrible than anything he had imagined. The community he had devoted himself to serving had been founded on deception, and the sanctuary where he had sought spiritual guidance had become the site of deliberate murder to protect that initial fraud. Yet even as he grappled with these revelations, the analytical part of his mind questioned, how could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate conspiracy? The answer would come sooner than expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Ravenwood Hollow. As the Sullivan family gathered for breakfast in Dr. Thornton's home, two riders approached the settlement from the Northern Trail. The travelers introduced themselves as Edward Livingston, a county clerk from Louisville, and Benjamin Harper, a government surveyor. They explained they were conducting an official review of land grants throughout the region to resolve long-standing boundary disputes. "We're particularly interested in the original deeds for this settlement," Livingston explained as he accepted Thornton's offer of coffee. "Our records show some irregularities in how this territory was transferred from its previous occupants." Thornton felt his pulse quicken. These officials had arrived with no prior notice, yet their purpose aligned precisely with the secrets the Sullivan children had revealed just hours earlier. Before he could formulate a response, William Sullivan appeared at his side with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of the children's interactions. "Mr. Livingston," he said with unusual directness, "you're not just here about boundaries. You have letters from a woman named Sarah Two Rivers whose grandmother lived on this land before Ravenwood Hollow existed." Livingston's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "How could you possibly know about Sarah Two Rivers?" he demanded. "Those letters are confidential government communications that haven't been shared with anyone in this region." Samuel materialized. beside his cousin, his whisper carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Her letters are in your saddlebag, wrapped in blue cloth." She included a map showing where her family's cabin stood, right where this house is built now. The implication struck Thornton like a physical blow. If the children were correct about the contents of Livingston's saddlebag information they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means, it would provide further evidence of their inexplicable abilities. More importantly, it would confirm the accusations about Ravenwood Hollow's fraudulent founding. Livingston retrieved his saddlebag with urgent purpose, extracting a packet wrapped in faded blue fabric exactly as Samuel had described. "These documents arrived at our office 3 weeks ago," he said, his official demeanor temporarily abandoned in his astonishment. "They contain testimony from descendants of the mixed heritage families who claim they were forcibly removed from this land in 1831. No one in this settlement should have any knowledge of their existence." Harper, who had been quietly observing the exchange, addressed the Sullivan children directly. "How do you know about private government correspondence that hasn't been made public?" Elizabeth, the eldest, answered with that unnerving directness that characterized all the cousins' interactions. "The same way we know that your real purpose here isn't just to survey boundaries. You're investigating reports that several of the original displaced families were murdered rather than simply forced to leave." Harper's composure visibly faltered. "That information is known only to myself and 3 officials in Louisville. We haven't even documented those allegations in writing yet." Thomas Sullivan, who had been monitoring the exchange from across the room, finally spoke. "My wards don't access information through conventional means, gentlemen. They simply know things they shouldn't be able to know. I've stopped questioning how and learned to trust the accuracy of what they share." Elder Davidson, who had been summoned to meet with the government officials upon their arrival, entered Thornton's home in time to hear this exchange. At 72, he was the last surviving member of the original founding council that had established Ravenwood Hollow. His weathered face showed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You bring outsiders justice to matters you don't understand," Davidson said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had wielded for decades. "This settlement was carved from wilderness by God-fearing people who did what was necessary to create a haven for Christian families." "Necessary?" Harper responded sharply. "Was it necessary to forge land deeds? To displace families who had legal claim to this territory? To murder those who discovered your fraud?" Elizabeth looked directly at Elder Davidson, her young face showing unexpected compassion. "You didn't intend for anyone to die when you first came here," she said gently. "You convinced yourself the mixed families had no legal right to the land because their claim came through native heritage and freed slaves. You told yourself you were bringing proper civilization to wilderness." Davidson's facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you speak of intentions buried so deep I've scarcely acknowledged them to myself." "And the Crawfords?" Dr. Thornton asked, unable to contain the question any longer. "Was their death necessary too?" The old man sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said, his voice breaking. "Harold discovered the original deeds, documents we thought had been destroyed. He threatened to take them to the county authorities, to bring officials here who would return the land to families we'd driven out years before. Everything we'd built would have been lost." His confession hung in the air like smoke, suffocating in its implications. Livingston and Harper exchanged glances, the official nature of their visit now transformed into something far more serious. "Where are the Crawford bodies?" Harper asked directly. It was James who answered, his quiet voice carrying clearly. "Not in the cemetery where the markers stand. They're buried beneath the chapel floor, near the north wall. Harold and Catherine are side by side. The children are buried at their feet." Davidson's face went ashen. "How could you possibly know that?" "No one alive remembers those details except me." William moved to stand beside his twin. "The Crawford children show us in dreams," he said simply. "They want proper burial in consecrated ground, with their real names marked on real stones." Livingston wasted no time organizing an investigation. Within hours, several men from the community were carefully removing floorboards from the chapel's north section, guided by the Sullivan children's precise directions. Dr. Thornton watched with growing dread, knowing that each board removed brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Ravenwood Hollow's carefully constructed history. The excavation didn't need to go deep. Beneath the floor joists, they discovered human remains, 5 skeletons arranged exactly as James had described. The 3 smaller sets of bones confirmed the most terrible aspect of the crime, that children had been killed alongside their parents to preserve the community's secrets. Harper examined the site with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to documenting evidence. "This confirms the information in Sarah Two Rivers' letters," he announced grimly. "She claimed her grandmother witnessed the Crawford family being killed in the chapel after Harold Crawford tried to help the displaced families reclaim their land. But it was Elder Davidson's reaction that provided the most damning confirmation." The old man stared at the exposed remains with the expression of someone seeing ghosts from his past. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or a long overdue confession. "There were others," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Not just the families we displaced. Over the years, travelers who asked too many questions, officials who couldn't be bribed, witnesses who needed to be silenced. We told ourselves each death was necessary, that we were protecting something greater than ourselves." The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Ravenwood Hollow hadn't been built through honest labor and divine blessing. It had been established through fraud, maintained through intimidation, and protected through murder when other methods failed. But even as the evidence mounted, Thornton found himself grappling with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Sullivan cousins know details that no living person except Davidson should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met? How could they pinpoint the location of remains that had been hidden for 25 years? The answers would prove more disturbing than any rational explanation he might have constructed, challenging his understanding of death itself. As sunset cast long shadows across the excavated chapel floor, Thornton realized that his community stood at a point of no return. The truth was finally emerging after 25 years of careful concealment. But with it came questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. The Sullivan cousins stood together near the exposed remains, their young faces solemn in the fading light. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear, their expressions shifting between sadness and resolution as they gazed at the bones of children not unlike themselves who had died trying to uphold truth against power. Tomorrow would bring formal investigations and legal proceedings, but tonight belonged to the dead who had finally found voices through 5 children, who possessed knowledge that defied every rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ravenwood Hollow, bringing with it additional officials from the county seat. Word of the previous day's discoveries had traveled with remarkable speed, and Livingston had dispatched riders to bring appropriate authorities. By mid-morning, the small settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a circuit judge, and 3 federal marshals who had been investigating land fraud cases throughout the region. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.